Back during the summer of 2011, a few friends and I decided to organize a little camping trip to a forest just a few miles outside our hometown. Delamere Forest, despite being pretty small, presented us with a much needed opportunity to connect with nature. City living can be good, but it can be stifling, so any chance to get out into the countryside was well received. But as time went by and the date of the camping trip approached, things began to unravel. One by one, various friends called and texted to inform us that they wouldn't be attending, be it family illness, lack of cash, or just laziness. In the end, there was only two of us that actually decided to go. So, early on a sunny, summer morning, we boarded a train for the journey down to the forest. The weather was perfect, a cloudless sky with a light breeze that made the hike through the woods not nearly as oppressive as we were expecting. It didn't take long for us to find a spot in the shade that happened to be right next to a stream we could use for washing and drinking water. The only trouble was the spot was very open, visible to passerby, and not the least bit subtle. So it's late afternoon, we're tired from our hike, and we decide to build a fire to cook some dinner on. But here's the thing, building a small fire is an essential part of camping. Sure, but it attracts people. The smell of burning wood and the cooking food, the smoke. Sometimes you might as well be announcing yourself to the whole forest with a megaphone or something. But we know this, so we're not exactly surprised when a group of locals stumbles across our little camp and comes down to say hello. They seem friendly enough at first, and this might sound paranoid, but the whole time I just had this bad feeling about them. It fascinates me how human instinct can pick up on things like that, little clues in the body language or speech that lead us to believe that someone isn't being entirely genuine. I wasn't sure if it was the way the locals were looking at us, or the strange, probing questions they asked, but I knew they didn't have the best intentions. When they moved on and were out of earshot, my friend suggested we move the camp. Now he's normally the skittish one who I'm constantly telling to calm down or chill out, but on this occasion, I knew he was right. Maybe we were being a bit paranoid, but in instances like this, it's always better to be safe than sorry. So as tired and half drunk as we were, we packed up our stuff, doused the fire, and then started looking for another place to set up camp. Luckily, we found somewhere pretty quick. A heavily wooded hill that basically overlooked our old campsite on one side. Not that we had a direct view of it, but if you walked a minute or so away from the camp, we had a pretty good view of the surrounding area. At least, we did during the daytime. As the sun set, we started another fire, cooked ourselves up some ramen noodles in our mess tins, then proceeded to drink and smoke ourselves stupid. We talked bullshit around the fire until we were too tired and drunk to continue, then retired to our poncho shelters for the night. I'm pretty sure I passed out as soon as I got into my sleeping bag, as I don't remember drifting off or anything. I just know that the next thing that I can recall is opening my eyes in the pitch darkness to the sound of a distant car revving its engine. At first, I was just annoyed to be woken up. The hangover was kicking in hard, and I felt like boiled crap as I tried to fall back asleep. But the distant vehicle kept revving its engine, and as the sound grew louder and louder, I knew it was getting closer. Something told me to go and check it out by the time I started to hear voices. It might have just been a bunch of kids taking a stolen car for a spin, but like I said, sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. But when I got to the edge of the hill, I can already see torch beams all over our old campsite. The revving engine was from the vehicle that had been driven all the way down the forest path to our previous camp. Someone was down there, looking for us. I think I acted more out of instinct than anything else, moving as quickly and quietly as I could back to my sleeping friend to wake him. I must have explained what I'd seen like 2 or 3 times. He was just as exhausted and half drunk as I was, but when it sank in, he was up on his feet with me and helping me kick the dirt on our dying fire. We then grabbed the pair of binoculars we were carrying with us, and then ran back to the edge of the hill to watch the scene below. In utter horror, we could see what was in the men's hands. Thanks to the torches, they shone on one another. Baseball bats, hammers, and a length of rope were just a few of the things they carried. They spat and cursed, furious that they'd come back too late to catch us, and do God knows what. All we had were our Swiss Army knives to defend ourselves with. If the guys down there had decided to actually search the area, they'd have found us pretty easy, and I'm not sure I'd be here typing this today. But to our infinite fortune, they didn't. Maybe they'd been drinking themselves or were just too lazy to actually look for us. But thank God they didn't. With one person keeping watch, the other went back to camp to pack their gear as fast as they could. The guys down below were hanging around our old camp, taking out the fire we'd so carefully constructed, taking all their spite out on the things we'd left behind. As I've mentioned, they didn't seem keen on actually looking for us, but they didn't seem like they were in a hurry to leave either. This meant we were essentially stuck on the wooded hill, as an escape attempt with our heavy packs meant that, if we were discovered, there would be no outrunning any of them, especially since they had a vehicle. We ended up staying there until morning. Neither of us could get any sleep, despite the gang leaving with their vehicle. I remember being terrified that they'd return with more people and more torches to find us. But they didn't. They were probably sleeping off their own hangovers by the time we were on the train home. We were due to stay another 2 nights, and I was still annoyed. that we had to call this trip short. But with those scummy local thugs around, we just didn't want to risk it. Be careful when you're traveling around, whether it's internationally or locally, because despite the unfathomable kindness of strangers, some of them aren't so friendly. I live in Burlington, Ontario, a nice lakeside city near Toronto. This story happened to me during a school trip when I was in the 8th grade. At my elementary school, which by the way was Catholic, everyone in the 8th grade would get to go on 2 trips as part of their final year at the school. One trip took place in the fall, and was usually a religious camping trip that took place about 40 minutes out of the city. By religious, I mean everyone had to participate in group activities that revolved around being a good Christian and teamwork, etc. This, of course, completely sucked, as this camp was little more than a religion class stretched to 3 days. The second school trip always took place in the spring, and was usually a trip to Ottawa for the weekend, where we could explore the city and visit museums. For some reason, it was decided my year would instead take another camping trip at a camp I will not name, about 4 hours away at Algonquin Provincial Park. The camp was on one of the many lakes in the park, and was set up like a pretty typical summer camp. Cabins were spread out near the lake and partially in the forest, and there were bathrooms and a mess hall in separate buildings. As you would guess, boys and girls shared separate cabins. The girls' cabins were built on supports above the ground, and were the ones closer to the lake. Our cabins were almost in the forest, and built on the ground along a gravel road. I shared a larger cabin with about 4 other guys. Although our cabin was the largest, it was probably the least comforting. While the other cabins had actual windows and doors that would fully close and lock, our cabin looked like it was built from balsa wood, only had thin bug screens for windows, and a door that wouldn't close. I should also point out that I had no experience with actual camping, as my family hates it, so this was a pretty bad first impression. This is where the creepy story actually starts. On the first evening, we were all gathered outside the mess hall for a fun night activity. The camp counselors told us about a hermit that lived in the nearby woods. The activity was that they were going to take us into the dark woods in groups to see where this hermit lived. This kind of caught us by surprise, as it was quite random, but intriguing at the same time. As you would expect, Everyone was pretty much screaming as we were led deeper into the woods, with only our flashlights, looking for this hermit's house. When we finally came across his house, which was little more than a huge log with a makeshift bed, we were led back to camp. Although my group didn't see anything, other people started talking about seeing someone creep around the dark woods. Someone in my cabin even said they saw blue, glowing eyes in the darkness. I shrugged it off, thinking the whole hermit story was made up by the camp to scare us, and the person in the woods was just a counselor. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of someone sprinting down the gravel road that ran near our cabin. At first I was startled, and a little creeped out, but then I thought it might have just been an animal. That was, until I started hearing the gravel crunch around our cabin. It was very soft, but definitely a person. I was suddenly terrified. My bed was right beside the door that didn't lock. An animal could have easily pushed the door open on its own and walked inside if it wanted to. There was also nothing covering the screens, so the person outside could clearly see in. I was ready to scream as loud as possible if someone entered the cabin. I had my eyes locked on the door, anticipating to see it slowly open, but it never did. The sound outside slowly disappeared into the woods. Immediately, I thought it must have been the hermit. I ruled out the possibility of it being a counselor or teacher, because it was at least 3 in the morning, which was an odd time to check on students. Surprisingly, I was able to fall back asleep a short while later. That was the only interesting part of the camping trip, unfortunately. The rest of the trip was pretty dreadful. It rained non-stop for the remaining days, and a few people from my class caught the flu from another school that was sharing the camp with us, so the bus was partially quarantined on the way back home. As time passed, I mostly forgot about the creepy encounter, giving in to the possibility that it was just a counselor checking on us. The story doesn't end there, though. The following year, it was my younger sister's turn to go on the same 8th grade camping trip. Just like my class, she also had to go on the weird hermit expedition during the first night. Although she initially thought nothing of it, during one of the other days when she and a few friends were exploring the woods along the lake, she described seeing a small hermit-like person sitting on a log in the distance. I know this isn't the scariest camping story to be told, but it creeps me out knowing that the hermit was indeed real, and that this camp thought it was fun to lead a bunch of kids to this random person's house in the middle of the woods. The hermit also isn't afraid to peek on unsuspecting campers in the dead of night. It's been almost 10 years since this happened, and I haven't done anything camping related since. I loved camping. I used to spend every waking moment either camping or planning a camping trip. I love being outdoors, away from the suffocating mundanity of everyday events, the first world problems. I used to do it pretty hardcore too, making shelters instead of taking a tent, drinking from mountain streams, hunting and setting traps for our food. So in April of last year, 2 friends and I departed on a 4-night camping trip on the Appalachian Trail. With loads in excess of 50 pounds, we marched 20 miles into the lush, green hills before reaching our first major water source. A long strip of tranquil, clear water set in a picturesque valley. The journey took 2 days, with around 18 hours of straight marching, our packs digging agonizingly into our shoulders with every step, yet the sense of achievement was intoxicating. Days and nights rolled by as we worked on our way along the trail, foraging food as we went. It was tiring, a constant struggle, but the sense of peace that the outdoors can provide is profound. At night, we skewered hot dogs on sticks, wolfing them down as we warmed sweet apple cider in our mess tins over the fire. We listened to owls call out like ghosts, and watched embers dance up into the air like fireflies as our eyelids grew heavy. We had a fair amount of fruit, and fresh water was plentiful, but our attempts at finding protein came short at each turn. We were unable to find any duck eggs, too slow or too experienced to snare rabbits, and our improvised fishing rods weren't working as well as we were used to. We were getting desperate, and although we were trying, man cannot live on cereal bars and a peanut butter alone. We would have to make a journey to the nearest town, nearly 7 miles away. Needless to say, we got lost. After a few hours of walking, we began to climb a fairly steep hill by means of a shortcut. The whole way up, I remember watching a thick fog cling to the top of the hill, at least 500 meters above us. Only it wasn't exactly clinging. It was just waiting for the temperature to drop low enough for it to roll down onto us, over us, and it did. I remember the image of my friend Chris being severely obscured as I walked behind him. We tried to remain cheerful when we started to see the remains of newborn lambs. April is birthing month for sheep, so this isn't necessarily an unusual sight, but these remained completely unscathed. No scavengers had touched these corpses, and there were a lot of them. Needless to say, we were relieved when the outline of a cottage came into view. We had absolutely no idea where we were, and there was no mention of any cottage on our map. My feet ached and our water supplies dwindled, having not expected to be out or lost for such a long time. We decided to stop and ask for directions. We had to climb over a low dry stone wall to reach the building itself, as the cottage was oddly set into the hillside. I noted with grim interest that there was no path leading to or from any kind of roadway or highway, the dwelling being completely cut off from all human contact. We stopped as we reached the front gate, or what passed as a front gate. It was made of a few roughly cut tree limbs, crudely bound with rusty nails and rotting twine. Chris tried to open it, but there was no hinge. It just fell back into his hands. He set it aside politely, albeit confused. The small courtyard before the front door was overgrown with weeds, grass, growing long between broken slabs of concrete beneath our feet. Dotted around a smaller front garden was an assortment of curios placed in decorative positions. Things were tied to branches of sapling in the center of the haggard lawn. Small toy cars, a tennis ball, a hairbrush. A wheelbarrow sat at the foot of it, filthy from exposure, containing a few soggy-looking books, some VHS cassettes, and a children's action figure. They were oddly arranged in a rough circle around the action figure. Arriving nervously at the door, I reached my arm out, feeling it grow heavy as I made a fist. I rapped 3 times, feeling it shake under the force, then waited, listening for signs of life, peering through a small, filthy window to the right of the decrepit door. I could make out yet more assorted, seemingly non-related items scattered on shelves and tables. That's when I turned to Chris. I remember simply remarking that we should move on, that there was no one home, but he didn't respond. There was something about him. He looked pale and confused. I can hardly explain it now that I try to recall it. He'd been looking through the grubby windows as I'd been knocking on the door, and had gotten a much better look inside the house. It was almost like he'd seen something, but just couldn't explain what. He began shaking his head violently, hyperventilating as he rushed out of the little courtyard. I was confused, a little frightened, and began shouting after him, asking just why the hell he was acting so strange. Yeah, the little cottage was weird as hell, but he was acting like he'd seen a ghost. He only replied to me once through gritted teeth, "We need to leave, now." Later that night, while we were nursing beers around our campfire, I finally plucked up the courage to ask him what he'd seen through the window. He started shaking his head in that same weird way, stuttering as he tried to find the words to articulate himself. He went on to explain that someone had been in the cottage that whole time, hiding from us. That as I'd been banging away, trying to get their attention, that they'd taken one celerity look outside at us, right into my buddy's eyes. My buddy said he'd never seen anyone so messed up, that he couldn't tell if they were disabled or they'd just been beaten so badly that their face had been rearranged. He said that when they locked eyes, the figure on the other side of the glass had looked terrified, but there's no way they could have been surviving alone up there. Something else was living there too. Something that might have been heading back to us, to arrive at any moment. I thank God we didn't find out what it was. Me and some friends decided to go camping in the Jersey woods for the May long weekend 2014. In total, there were 7 of us, all guys, who wanted nothing more than to have a nice camping weekend, getting drunk and hanging with friends. We got there just after 3 o'clock and had a good 10-minute walk through the forest until we reached a clearing that was hidden from the road. We parked the car on a pathway leading towards the clearing we were camping at, and pretty much as soon as we got there, one of my friends, Bobby, who started up the portable camping grill he brought, began cooking the hot dogs and burgers, while me, Greg, and Colton set up the tents. To get the names out of the way, there was me, Bobby, Greg, Colton, David, Jeff, and Jeffrey. Me and Colton were sharing a tent together, while Bobby, David shared one, and Jeff and Jeffrey shared another. We'd also brought a speaker with us to play music, and eventually that evolved into drunk singing once everyone had a substantial amount of alcohol. The time was around 11 p.m., and we were far from calling it a night when we first heard it. The sound of someone whistling from within the woods. Being a bit drunk, we all sort of passed it off until we noticed that it wasn't just coming from behind us, but also to our left, and our right, and from across the lake. David got up and went to turn the speaker back on, and before we all knew it, he was blasting heavy metal, in what we all could only guess was an attempt to tell whoever it was doing the whistling that we weren't interested. He played the heavy metal for about a whole 4 minutes, one song I think it was, before turning the music off and sitting back down. We all spent about another 2 hours awake, and didn't hear the whistle anymore after that. So thinking it was some dickhead kids trying to punk us, we must have just got bored and fucked off. All our nerves were calmed enough. When 3 a.m. came around, we all decided to call it a night. The whistling was the last thing that was on my mind. That was, until I heard it once again. The same whistling we heard not long ago was back, but this time it seemed much closer and more ominous, almost like there was multiple people who were whistling. Both me and Colton shot up straight and looked at each other, both of us clearly shitting the bed. We heard Bobby call over to our tent, asking if we heard that, to which we told him we did. Jeff and Jeffrey, who were the closest to the forest entrance, yelled out that they were scared, and started frantically asking what we should do. The whistling seemed to be getting closer to us, like whoever was doing it was approaching our position. Bobby panicked as we heard him rip the zipper of his tent open, and then running out before he yelled for us to all get in the truck. Not knowing what caused him to say that, we quickly but cautiously got out of the tent and saw what Bobby was talking about. Along the entire tree line were people who looked to be armed with various weapons, possibly even guns, although I can't be sure about that. As we all ran to the truck, not giving a shit about our camping equipment, we watched as all the people along the tree line, almost in unison, began walking in sync towards us as we piled in the vehicle. Bobby had the keys, put the car in a drive, and with all of us in there, Bobby sped out of the clearing that we were at, and towards the path we entered from at an unsafe speed. But at the time, we weren't thinking about that. All we were worried about was our truck getting overrun. As we were driving out from the woods, when we looked out our windows, we could see more people running through the woods towards our vehicle. The whole time they were doing so, they continued to whistle. The whistling was so loud we could all hear it from inside the car with its windows shut. We eventually made it onto the road and sped away in the direction we came from. Even though all of us had a lot of alcohol in our systems, at that point in time, I believe we were all running on pure adrenaline, and while I don't condone what we did, I'm just thankful that nothing tragic happened while one of us was behind the wheel. We eventually stopped at the first motel that we came across, where we got rooms and all slept for probably 8+ hours. None of us ever returned to that area, but we often bring up this experience in conversations, usually theorizing about what those people wanted, or what their intentions were. Given how many of them there were, Colton said that he believes it was some kind of off-the-grid cult, who didn't want people coming onto their land for whatever reasons, possibly because of something more sinister that might be happening in those woods.